Om Mantranam Jiva Bhuta Tuya Shmita Shakti Rupaya Tatahina Vavarohe Nishvalaha Sharda Bravat. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. She whom the ancient seers of India know and remember as the imperishable Shakti is the meaning in all the slokas and sutras of the revealed scriptures of India. Without her, O fair ones, all the tattvas of nature would be like clouds with no rain. She is the perfect I consciousness existing in the multitude of words, and the secret of all the mantras, whose very being is the essence of non-duality. Om peace, peace, peace. Om Guru Brahma Guru Vishnu Guru Devo Maheshwaraha Gurureva Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Jaya Vivekananda Ki Jaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. We are now gathered for the second series of classes, class 1 of part 2, on how mantra destroys karmas. Both those words have received some sort of a welcome and an acknowledgement in the Western culture in these modern times, although they are ancient Sanskrit terms. When we think of the word karma, of course, there's a little bit of a wincing that's going on inside, as we usually turn towards the negative side of karma. But we must remember that, as we've been studying in our earlier series on the mantra, that there are several types of karma, several shades of karma. And we must study it deeply. For instance, that it has, it's color-coded, you might say, white, gray, and black, and also, intriguingly enough, colorless, a fourth kind or color of white being, of course, that good karma, and black being negative, and gray being mixed karma, which is very confusing to people when, as they say nowadays, bad things happen to good people and vice versa. But there's this colorless karma that puts to rest all that confusion and contention, is one can just reach that path of non-dual abidance, as we just chanted about, which is the Shakta Advaita Vada, the path of Divine Mother Wisdom, and how it unifies everything, bringing everything back to that word yoga, which is also another Sanskrit word that has been made very popular, but has also retained at least some of its integrity amidst the physical yoga that's become sort of the obsession in this culture anyway, in the West. But we look towards yoga to be a kind of practice that will neutralize or at least attenuate these karmas that are rising, because that's another teaching on karma, that it has these phases. It can hide, like your present karma is doing. It's called prarabdha. Or it can be of the past, called sanchita, from past lifetimes. And then it's also stored up for the future, which is called agami karma. So those are the three types of karma as they're correlated with the phases of time over a series of lifetimes. And then even there's this kind of spontaneous arising karma, which I was just mentioning. It's called Kriyamani. Just like one song in India says, these white beetles keep coming out of the woodwork. Householders trying to get rid of this pestilence in his house. and he doesn't know where they come from, how they breed, so forth. So all of a sudden it just comes forth out of the very woodwork of his house. And in that way we find out there's this karma that just rises like that spontaneously. And of course it's along with all the other phenomena that's constantly rising and falling in the minds of human beings. So it all begins to connect back to the mind and actions done in the three phases of time. And we've been looking at that in the first series, the last 3 weeks, or 2 weeks I think, previous to our seminar last week where we took a break. We had these teachings mostly centering around the mantra. We had the 21 points of mantra practice covered over 4 phases of how those 21 fall into these phases. And also then we looked at the Shakti power that's presiding over each one of those phases. So very integral and powerful connection to this wonderful teaching on mantra. And this week we'll look at some of the facts about mantra, which are more just observances we can make. If there are any doubts or any missing gaps in our thinking about it, where it came from, what it accomplishes, and what the seers have noticed about the practice of mantra, we can look at that and how it attenuates karma. So we focused more on that, and we should probably look a little bit more at karma in these next 2 or 3 classes, which we intend to go on studying and scrutinizing this. We want to start out with this chart on my right. It's a wonderful Sanskrit word, Manaha Prana Sambandha. Sambandha just means a relationship with, a beneficial relationship with. So the teaching is a positive one. The word is very illuminating. It shows how mana, mind, and prana, life force, need to be connected. And then a good point could be made that because karma is coming forth, that doesn't get attenuated and that bothers people's existence, rising up from, whether it rises up from unknown sources or whether it just returns. Everything goes around and comes around kind of fashion. Whatever the case may be, this return of karma is to be studied and looked at in it, so we can begin to see the sources or the origins of these actions that we did, which produced these results. So the connection between mana and prana, the relationship between them, in Sanskrit there's a word for that. So you could see that they're probably, number one, aware of the need for having your life force connected into your thoughts, whether connecting the physical to the mental, you might say. And also number two, that there are instances of people who got their life force severed from the mind. The connection wasn't kept as they went from lifetime to lifetime. And that's one way of explaining the existence of the ocean of suffering, the samsara sagara. Otherwise, there's really not a lot of good ways to explain why people suffer and why some people say, blame it on the divine, like, oh, God makes some suffer and causes others to enjoy, and might as well then add to that, illumines others. So along these walks of life, whether they be twofold or threefold, that is the awakened, the unawakened, and those who are in the process of awakening, we probably can look towards karma as, to quote Vivekananda, as being the God of this universe. There's no other God here but you, he might say. That is the Atman that is within you, that pure nature, that's existing in everything here as the all-pervasive presence. Otherwise, you want to look at it otherwise, then basically there's this cause for this karma that's rising and falling all the time. So one would look at that and say, seems like that's what's going on here in this universe, that people are trying to deal with the uprising of various results of actions done. And a lot of that turns toward the gray and towards the black. Basically, the confusion and the negativity that surfaces. So with a word like that, manaha, prana, sambandha, gives us a good opportunity to embark on a journey into what a spiritual life in the world should look like, and then why it doesn't look like that. Because I created a new chart yesterday and was rushing today before class to try and get some version of it printed out. Please excuse any small type errors there might still be in it, because it'll be upgraded. But at least to have it on hand today, and to show what this sin is all about. The only sin, Vivekananda said, is weakness. So this lack of strength that comes about by losing connection of the mind to the prana, because it's out of the mind that these bodies are born, and prana is the vehicle that takes the transmigrating soul outward into the worlds of name and form. It's also the prana, if you get control of it, that can involute the soul back to its source, all the way up to what's called the psychic prana. Vivekananda mentioned that in his commentary on the Yoga Sutras. He left behind a very simple commentary on Yoga Sutras. His real meaning here and his place here was to introduce us to the Vedanta, so we'd have a very high-minded philosophy to follow, which, because here in the West, religion had really failed us on that level. And it was proposing ideas like sin and damnation and hellfire and that sort of thing, to sort of scare the soul maybe to move along from its complacency. Whatever the case may be, there are much better ways to do it, like inspire the soul. And so he came and he'd say, why give people this dirty ditch water to drink when the river of truth is flowing right next to them? So this river of truth is the presence of the Atman in Vedanta. And if it's a strange word to us at first, and we shirk from the words like karma when we find out what they mean, then there should be a practice called yoga which can connect us back to towards our true self. That is, from objects to senses that are attached to them, to inner senses in dream, and then to psychic prana, which moves the thoughts inward further to the mind and to the great mind. And finally on to the witness, and from the witness into the Atman and Brahman, which is Vedantic territory. Then you're talking about something that's really particular to and specific to Vedanta and Advaita Vedanta. So there's a good march. If there's a march of ignorance and diseases, as Ram says in the Ramayana, outward, there must be a march inward back toward back toward the source, which will then take us to this Divine Mother Wisdom, which is part and parcel of what's called the mantra. And the mantra, as you've seen, if you've been watching the classes, or if you've heard, if you've been following the Dharma, is a combination of power words called bijams, which are surrounded by divine names, like Shiva, or nowadays Ramakrishna. So we have these power words that are connected to the names of the Lord. And if you repeat these formulas that have been repeated by many realized beings and have been infused, as you heard on the song if you were listening 10 minutes before our class started, that this ocean of nectar into which the gods and the avatars have poured their life force was the beautiful song Vivekananda wrote about that, and which is stored in full measure in Sri Ramakrishna. So that's what we're talking about, is building up, retaining, if you want to call it retrieving and retaining, this power that's in us as prana, life force. Because man does not live by bread alone, there's a prana in it. You might interpret that saying that way. And you want to eat that food, retain that prana, transmute it, and bring it up. And we'll look at that process a little bit if any of you were at the seminar, SRV seminar last week, that we were calling readiness, preparation, and follow-through, was the title to that. And you saw that chart that I might show briefly today about the path of refinement of food. Because to get to the prana, or knowledge of the prana, is going to be one step or one feat that we have to accomplish. Because when Vivekananda came here to the West, he said they don't have any provision for prana, the existence of prana in their religion there, and they don't have any teachings on the tan matras. So he had words for them from the ancient Sanskrit, and he brought them, he was trained in them, and he had mastered them, the pranas, the tan matras. He was aware of them, and then he could have an inner life, because without this inward moving prana, then the soul just rests in complacency with the objects outside in the world of name and form, and gets weaned in life by appearances. And those appearances then are in the province of the god of karma, and also the god of kama, desire, and also, unfortunately, the god of death, called Yama. So in this province of lack of consciousness, or forgetfulness, if you want to put it that way, there are some real bad risks to living in that way. That's why there is such a thing as, we say, the ocean of suffering, samsara, and other words for it, Maya, or in the ancient Indian times, they used the word samsara pragbara. There was a dam of souls, like a river of souls that was dammed up to move only in one direction, and that was towards lower births in ignorance. If you want to borrow the word hell, you would call that lower sunken grounds, or patalas in our traditions here in the East. Again, there are Sanskrit words for these, so words are very important, as we looked at it yesterday's satsang in the morning. If you want, all join us and take in an hour of blissful dharmic teachings that prepare the mind for these eventualities in the realm of relativity. Another word you might call it for samsara, maya, and pragbara. So yeah, a lot of people are very good at just sort of, oh, never mind all that, I'll just keep my mind positive. But they try to do that, and they might be able to do it on the outside. It is basically, there are good people there, but they're not spiritually realized people. There are good people there, but they're just moral people. There are good people there, but their morality is beginning to fall apart, and they're beginning to engage in immoral acts like war. Society is going to war with one another. What about all that? You can't just push that under the rug and call yourself spiritual. It's a kind of pretentiousness. And so the great souls like our Swami Vivekananda, whose birthday is Tuesday, I believe, 2 days from now, which is why I opened up with the Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara stotram, out of the Guru stotram, that verse, to refer and revere him as the deity. And it's good to bring him up in the context of this subject, because like I said, he was aware of words like prana, tanmatras, and karma, and mantra. And he was one of those that helped bring the meaning of those words to us. For instance, Maya, people were calling that illusion, but he came and renamed it. He said, no, that's not true. There's some people over from India and from the East about the same time as he came to the Param of Religions in 1893, and he heard them talking about Maya and trying to explain that to Westerners. And he would jump in and say, that's not, Maya's a statement of fact, actually, if you want to look at it philosophically. It's not just an illusion. It causes delusion in the mind, and as far as illusion goes, everything here is dreamlike and illusory. So why just blame it all on Maya when everything you're doing is also dreamlike? So he renamed it and said it's Namarupa Desha Kala Nimitta. And they would say, oh, what are those words? Talking about the power of words. Well, that's name, and how a thing gets named other than what it truly is, the Atman. And that's form, and that's how something covers your formless nature. And that's Kala, time, which is a river that flows from the ancestors to you and back again, from heaven to earth to hell. And it's Desha, space. It's these levels of space which you're only looking at one level of, called the physical level, when there are 4 other levels of space within you. Kingdoms of heaven within you are different akashas. And then nimitta at the end, cause and effect, that which brings karma to you, even if you do good actions. And when the results of your good actions come back to you, those also act as chains, because you're caught in a loop of good and bad. That's a gold chain and an iron chain. So he had different ways of explaining these things, so that we would be aware of the negative and also aware that the good or the positive wasn't enough to live a spiritual life. So that is I guess my preamble, which I didn't really plan because we're only here for an hour and 15 minutes together on these recent Sundays. So I want to then move towards a chart here that I want to take for this next 3 series of classes called, which I've already explained to you, Manaha Prana Sambandha, the relationship between the mind and the life force. Get this microphone from rubbing if you're hearing that, and move on to this chart. This is, somebody asked me about this chart earlier today. Is it in Footfalls? Because we've put out now the 300 charts or so. There's now 370 as of yesterday. But the 300 charts I put out over some 5 years or so is now in a book called Footfalls of the Indian Rishis, with full commentary, in full color. It's a large book, yes, some 800 pages, which people are beginning to get their own copies of, and you can write to SRV to do that. We can have it sent to you, even through Amazon and so forth. But someone was asking me today about this chart, if it was in Footfalls, and I said, yes, it is. It's, in fact, the number on it here, I see it's number 32 in my list. So it's one of those that came out fairly early because it should be accounted for that we have a body-mind mechanism. I guess you could call that the body and the brain. Or sometimes I've heard the body called the worm, and the brain called the noodle. So it's the worm and the noodle that we're living in here. Which is transitory, subject to disease and death. You know the spiel about it. So if that be the case, then we ought to become aware of a subtle body, which is not the physical body, and something that we call mind that's different from the brain. And therefore, when we open up the avenues of thinking like this, which have been closed down, which I'll show you in another chart we'll take up today, if we can get to the 2 of them. If it becomes closed down, then a person lives what Vivekananda called a gray little study of a life and never knows the deeper meaning. All those questions, where do we come from? What's the meaning of being here? Where are we headed? All of those questions get answered immediately in the Vedanta if you will move towards that atmosphere and find an illumined preceptor who has trained in the Vedanta and probably has some very good expertise in yoga. Yoga meaning the 8-limb yoga and Kundalini yoga. Those 2 are of paramount importance. Also, the 4 yogas, the 4 main yogas of wisdom, devotion, work, and meditation. Those 3 definitions for yoga I think would be prominent, should be prominent in your minds if you want to know the meaning of the word yoga, beyond just that it means natural union with yourself or with the jiva that is Shiva, the doing away with a apparent line of demarcation between the Jivatman and the Paramatman, when the 2 are always and ever one, like a wave is one with the ocean. So you can see the subtitle on this chart already that I hope you're seeing, Connecting the Living Prana to the Luminous Mind. And the Prajna Upanishad, which is one of the few Upanishads that brings prana into the teachings. For instance, I was saying last week at the seminar that you don't find prana mentioned a lot in the 24 cosmic principles of Samkhya, for instance. You just sort of have to infer that there's something that's causing consciousness to flow amidst these tattvas. That divine mother power I just chanted about at the beginning of the class. Without her, then all these tattvas, like tasting, touching, seeing, hearing, smelling, earth, fire, water, air, ether, well, they would be like clouds with no rain. So, there are people who think that way or feel that way. They're not getting any satisfaction out of life. And what they do get turns negative or turns to karma, comes back at them. So there must be something missing then in our connections to make life meaningful, and to know the origin of the embodied soul, and to know the ultimate destination that it's headed towards. And so because we've lost connection to the living prana, then we have failed to treat our minds the way a good, healthy physical athlete would be treating his body. He wants it to be in good shape for all the competition he has ahead. We should be looking at our minds that way as a subtle body, which is now starving because the lifelines of the prana have been cut off to it. And it's not thinking right, it's not thinking clearly, and it's got various forms, granthis, knots, blockages in it, into the channels leading to it, which aren't just nerves from body to brain to heart and so forth, but are going on in an interior set of koshas, body, the subtle body and causal body. And if we could get in and inspect those, say by meditation, we could see, oh, there's a blockage there. I have to open that up. I have to untie that knot and make this prana flow again to my mind. And then the thinking becomes clearer, and the life force flows. And as the Upanishads say, the mind expands in its capacity to know Brahman. So the Prajna Upanishad says here, the prana comes into the body from the Atman by an act of the mind. That pretty much says it. Could almost stop there with that sentence. The prana, this life force that's hidden, and which is of 5 forms. We'll look at that maybe over the next couple series of classes. It comes into the body via the mind. So there's that connection. Manaha prana sambandha. Whatever the mind thinks, that flows in and out via the prana. And verily leads, along with the Atman, into the desired realm. So what to speak of the realms that you go to after you pass from the body? If you have your prana under your control, then you give up the body and you pass into the realm of this, say, the gods, or the realm of the ancestors, or beyond those two, to the realm of Shiva and Vishnu and so forth. So that's one way of looking at it. You can also look at it that there are realms right here in your everyday life. You operate in them all the time. You operate at the physical level for a while where you're concerned about your body only. Then all of a sudden you're starting to study, you're concerned more with your intellect, that's another realm. You go to the kitchen and you want to eat some good, solid, substantial, healthy food, and now you're in the realm of prana. Your mind shifts, as it were, to these different realms. So whether you think about the realm as being right here now, or in the future, or from the past, as we were saying, because there's those 3 assignments, then you have this very good teaching from the Prajna Upanishad. 6 questions on the nature of prana and reality. So that's a good sloka for all of you to look back on, memorize, and do your manana, your thinking process on. Basically, this chart, if we want to just give it a general introduction, this is where it's very interesting that it all starts out with food. It's been since the 60s, and when we were introduced to yoga, and in the 70s, when Buddhism and Zen Buddhism came along, and then Tibetan Buddhism came along in the 80s, and there's been a sort of decade by decade step, each sampling or cross-sampling these different traditions from the East, and seeing, do I like the one that came from Japan after 52 generations from India, or do I like the one that talks about Kundalini Shakti and the mysticism of that, or do I like the meditation path of the Chinese Buddhism, or do I like the doing zikr of the Sufis? I mean, the West over some 56 years, and I've been alive for 70 of it, 72 as of last week, has passed through these phases of, we used to call it spiritual menu tasting, but to give it more credence than that, some of us became very interested in certain paths and began to commit ourselves to them and follow them deeply. Come to find out later that that's what we were doing. We were connecting the prana to our mind so that our mind could receive benefit, a higher vibration, if you will, better vrittis, better chitta vrittis, vibrational thoughts, because they were gravitating around things of nature. So that's why I smile when I say this. What starts with food, because there are food faddists out there who maybe to this day think that what you eat somehow gives you enlightenment, or what you don't eat won't give you enlightenment. And of course that's simplifying it way too much and passing over a lot. But to say that it starts with food, there are several traditions in India, like the Kundalini Yoga system, which are very important for that. That food, if we just want to take a quick tour, as I said, is meant to give you strength, because weakness, we'll look at that in a minute, is what a lot of people are suffering right now. And yes, if you're born in the body and your body's weak, then it's very unlikely that your mind is going to be strong. You're going to be affected by the body, and it's the weightiness of the body, by the heaviness of matter and materialism. Even if you're not, your mind tends to think about materialism, like a materialistic culture, or science with its obsession with atomic particles and matter only. So it's a kind of heaviness that is not opening up channels towards the divine, towards the true self, towards spirituality, towards true religion, towards understanding that the prana takes you in and out of waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, takes you to heaven after you pass, takes you beyond heaven if it's psychic prana. These are all things that are missing, you see, from just a materialistically based thinking mind. The brain, we could call that again. The noodle and the worm, the brain and the body. But you want to look at this in a higher way. So food is to gain strength. The strength then is not just to live a great little stubby of life, happy great little stubby of life, mewing like cats in your corners, to quote our birthday boy today. But is to increase stamina, because you're going to have to last a long time in order to breathe. And that's really what's coming up next if you want to look at it along the basic line of food. I could have drawn lines, 3 lines through all of this, and said that each one of these steps has a threefold division. And food and strength and stamina has 2. You might think stamina is so, I can make it through the workday. Well, that's a very basic way of, and gross kind of way of looking at it. But you want stamina to keep doing your practice once you've got the secret of the mantra, once you've got the secret of the teachings, you see, the Dharma. And you're not going to get that unless this prana opens up, and opens up your mind to the possibility of other things rather than just the world is my oyster, or I just want to gratify my senses through objects and pleasures and so forth. That's leading down an entirely different road. That's not even leading you towards stamina that gets you through the day. That's worse. It's weakness. After that stamina, as I just comment on each one of these little sectors here that we move through, you master your posture. And this isn't necessarily in the order which all of this happens. It's in a general order which the teachers of yoga and Kundalini and so forth, and Patanjali, father of yoga, have all noticed Basically, this is the way people proceed to get out of the body being myself. Get out of that stunted idea that the body is the self. It's almost natural to think that when you're first born, particularly when your parents and their parents acted that way, as if the body was everything to them, and they had no idea of their subtle body, except that maybe they did a little work on their intellect and gathered some knowledge and raised themselves up by that. So you might find that along the way that the nerves and passageways that are providing you 5 kinds of physical prana are being stepped on, like hoses. You used to go to your chiropractor, right? He had a spine hanging there in his office, and he'd tell you how the nerves going through the apertures in the spine, when the spine got twisted, it would step on that nerve. You'd take a photo, x-ray of that. You'd see how one nerve was thinner than the others around it. And then he'd say, it's like a hose got stepped on, and there's not enough. They didn't tell you what, because they didn't know about prana. He said, it's like energy, you see. Didn't get through that nerve to a certain organ anymore, so that became a problem, and you got a disease correlated with that. So, but if they had said, well, your prana is not flowing through that physical nerve to your physical organ, because your posture has been wrong all this time, and you're stepping on your own hoses with some subtle feet. So let's master your posture. Let's sit up straight, and let's breathe, and that's next. Master the posture so that energy can move into your senses, because now I'm seeing better, now I'm hearing better, now I'm tasting better. Oh, that's a better life. See, the risks about this when it starts with food is that it turns into just a healthy society with no refuge. Even the psychologists in the West aren't telling you about the necessity of separating your positive from your negative thoughts, the chittavrittis, based on a refuge that you're seeking. So that's going to be a necessary point to bring out and emphasize for people. So the senses are going to start functioning more like they should, and then your breathing is going to equalize. Or if it doesn't, then you should put your attention on the prana and help it to flow towards these channels. I remember that was some techniques before. Oh, my eyes are not so good today, then I'm going to bring prana to my eyes, focus my attention, my concentration there, so that my mind can make a connection, have a relationship with prana, so the two can work together, and all of a sudden I start seeing better. So, for instance, I haven't worn glasses for 72 years because I've always thought about, why should I? I should just think my eyes see good. So what the mind thinks, if the prana is connected to it, will happen. And you just put a little effort into it, and you have faith, you believe. And then if age comes and you do have to don a pair of glasses, you've gotten the most mileage out of your eyes, because the prana has been your companion. Now it's time to shut them down. And then another prana can take over, called psychic prana. It can take you into meditation. You don't need eyes anymore. You don't need to smell, hear, touch, taste. That's become old, you see. The prana is evacuating the body at that time. So this is why you would move on. You wouldn't get stuck just with a healthy lifetime, because everything here is rushing towards death the minute it's born. Quoting our birthday boy again. Everything's rushing towards death the minute it's born. And so Vivekananda would say, oh, here in the West, you didn't get the teachings we did in India. Our parents told us to meditate on death. I come over here and you think it's something morbid, and your parents are telling you, don't think about that right now. Well, there might be some practicality to not thinking about it, but there's much more benefit to thinking about it if you want to overcome fear, doubt, ignorance, and if you want to pass from the body consciously and have a conscious rebirth next time. These are all possibilities they don't tell you about, right? And not only possibilities, they're probabilities, because beings are experiencing them. and they've come back, like my Tibetan teacher. Oh, this is my 12th lifetime. It's just a matter of fact that I've been born 16 times. Or Krishna tells Arjuna in the Gita, I've had many lifetimes, and I remember them all. So there must come a point or a juncture when all of these connections are made, where the mind and its memory get in together, smriti, daiva smriti, and they remember all the best things that they've done, and their karma is now neutralized. Well, getting ahead of the game here as we look at it, but this is what we hear early on. So that's the first tier across here, the front, you see. Food, gain strength, increase your stamina, master your posture, purify your senses, and equalize your breathing. It's basic yoga 101. I want to tell you quickly then about food as we look at more toward the Kundalini. This chart is a combination of food as seen through Kundalini yoga, as it's seen through Patanjali's yoga, and as it's also seen, it's got some Vedantic elements to it that help us to understand. And it's an old war horse. I told you this chart we were just looking at was 32. This is number 3. So it was so important when I decided to put out what I call charting the scriptures of India, that I had some sort of an order to it, at least at the beginning. And I understood, because I grew up in the 50s and 60s as a young boy, and I saw the food faddism. I also saw the turn away from meat eating towards vegetarianism going on, and other very positive moves that people were making to, at that time, though they didn't know it, try and get rid of tamas, slothfulness, and rajas, restlessness. That's basically how you could crystallize it or condense it right now. That all those movements back there, and they were trying to slough off, like a snake sloughs off its skin, trying to slough off that skin of laziness and complacency, and that skin of restlessness. Simple words in Sanskrit, tamas and rajas, and to attain balance, sattva. And of course, if they attained it and they could hold it, then they thought they were enlightened, which of course was a great fallacy. There was much more to enlightenment than just sattvic balance in the body. So I give you this as an opening introduction to this chart, the title of which is The Role of Food and Prana in Achieving Self-Realization. So food has to go to prana, and then prana has to go inward to psychic prana, to the mind, with a relationship that allows the mind to achieve oneness with the Atman. That being the only reality is Brahman or Atman. So it's always a pleasure to quote Holy Mother's take on that. From pure food, one gets pure blood. From pure blood, it produces pure thoughts. Pure thoughts lead to pure minds, and pure mind is Brahman. So there's those atmospheres I was just talking about. If you can live, purify your mind by using this way of proceeding along this yogic path, all of a sudden you don't feel any difference between yourself and Brahman. I am that reality. Aham Brahmasmi, they say, or that thou art. You are that reality, and you feel fully aligned with it, and one with it, and merged in it. And then you can dissolve in it, and have a conscious death, and no more birth in the womb of matter for me. Prasad sings, only emanation from my Divine Mother. So the sun emanates and withdraws its rays day and night, as it were. So like that, the soul is feeling like it's at its source all the time. And it's just a matter of whether it wants to move out and take on a mind and an intellect and an ego, or not take them on and stay at the source, be the sun itself. These are the two movements called the path of the sun and the path of the moon, or the path of light and the smoking path by Sri Krishna in the Gita. So that's a beautiful thing to quote from Holy Mother. I want to jump straight to the ancient times with Vasishtha and read the quote on the bottom. Food taken with an ignorant or brooding mind turns to poison in the body. Food taken with clarity of mind conduces to perfect health. It is the fire of yoga in the form of physical, vital, and mental purification that makes the difference. I mean, so this chart I showed you first, Mana, Prana, Sambandha, was really what we're following, but you can see how it's led us to the very first part, a quick explanation about food, and that's why I've gone to this food, whose subtitle there, or whose title there was role of food and prana in all of this. So the important part there is that how the mind, what condition the mind is in when it eats. I mean, I think I mentioned a couple days ago that we just lost Thich Nhat Hanh, who is, this Vietnamese monk that lived 92 years and was very big on, trying to make peace when his country was being warred upon by America back in the Vietnam War days. So here you see him some 40, 50 years later, and passing from the body, but becoming known basically, if on the surface at least, for this idea of mindfulness. So this is what we're talking about here. If the mind, when it sits down to cook a meal and take a meal, does it in consciousness rather than just randomly or on the run or without considering the ingredients or without blessing it, because food that's not blessed is like eating poison. Both Holy Mother and Lord Vashishta, sort of two bookends for this teaching in India, have said that to us now. On the other hand, if you're conscious of it, this very food, the self-same food that turned to poison, can turn to nectar. So you see how important the prana and the mind is in such a matter as taking food. And I want to put it this way, is that if that knowledge isn't there, if that consciousness between the importance of food and prana and the mind is not there, then you have a society like we have today. Then you have a world like we have today. Then you have an age like we have today, Kali Yuga. And people are running here and there, eating all sorts of very unnutritious foods without blessing them. I see it all the time. Everywhere I go, when I do go anywhere these days, people sitting down after they get their food and just start cramming it in as fast as they can, standing up, walking away. So what happened to the importance of food? What happened to the sacredness of food? What happened to the careful act of taking the food? Because Brahmarpanam, Brahmahavir, Brahmagnau, Brahmanahutam, Brahmayavatena, what happened to the Brahma in all of that? In Sri Krishna's famous food blessing mantra in the Gita. So those are important questions to listen to and respond to. So the fire of yoga, Vashishta says, you can see where Vivekananda loved that term. He liked the words living intelligence, the fire of yoga. Those were terms he put into English and brought here to the West in the late 1800s to let us know that he existed on this higher octane fuel called prana or psychic prana. He ran on that fuel. And his life was an example of yogic connection and yogic excellence. He was born a perfect soul, quote Sri Ramakrishna about Swami Vivekananda. He was born a perfect soul. You hear Sri Ramakrishna say that in the Gospel of Ramakrishna. So I wanted to jump right away to these two quotes of these two bookends of yoga in India and show you how important food is. And in that context, we don't need to become food faddists. We can just say this is where food is important in order to pull ourselves out of rajas and tamas and to connect ourselves to the living flow of life force, to make us live dharmic lives, to allow us to become illumined, to reconnect us to our true self, and to get thee behind me, everything else that's not healthy or that's ungodly or irreligious. That's how you would take the in Vedanta, how you would explain and take the teaching of food right away. If you wanted to go any deeper with someone, then you'd see here on this chart the 7 chakras. This is where the Kundalini element comes in. You can see the lowest chakra connected to an abundance of food, a cornucopium of food. The Sanskrit being anehidam sarvam pratistam. Everything here is supported by food. So if you're in a physical body and you're having to eat physical food, then how's the best way to do that without becoming attached to the taste of food, without becoming attached to the pleasure it brings, and without becoming imbalanced and off track by following the culinary art as if it's the end-all and be-all of your existence, when food has a much, much more sacred meaning to it than that. It's shown by the far right column. Food with mantra is the first point they want. The mantra, uttered in deep meditation, when blessed by such sacred words, renders pure food into prasad. So there's explaining Yoga Vasishta's quote. If you wanted to go deeper with it, they want you to take that food. Hopefully it's of a sattvic quality. You know what that means. You know, it's maybe not contaminated by bad vibrations or by bad conditions, by sprays and that kind of thing, which have become prominent over the last century and so here in this country. They didn't really have to worry about that so much back in the times when the word organic wasn't even known, because everything was organic. They hadn't started spraying it yet. They let the bees have some of it, the flies have some of it, the worms have some of it, and they just worked around it. And what they ate was therefore pure on a physical level, more or less. As pure as food can get. But nowadays there has to be a little bit more extension of our understanding around that. So take that apple and, you know, and just don't say thank you, God, for this apple, because God's not listening. You know, God is you. God's the one who's taking the apple. God's the one who's washing the apple. God's the one who's eating the apple. God's the one who's getting the nutrition from the apple. Why are you thanking something outside for that? I mean, you might as well turn to nature and say thank you for this apple if you want to get closer to the truth of it. But nature's insentient, so that's not going to help you a lot. So the point is here is to connect everything back into consciousness and bless it so that the mantra, which is powerful, can have its purifying effect on matter. You see. Matter is what's giving us all this problem. Call it nature, call it prakriti. That's what we're getting attached to. As Sri Ramakrishna said, everyone's born, they see the garden, they run for it. Nobody ever stops and says, wait a minute, where's the gardener? So where's the source of this plenitude, this multitude, this variety, this vaichitra that's in nature? Where's the source of it? And how can I reach the source and make sense out of the act of eating, and the acts of excreting, and the act of digestion, and the act of breathing? Because these are all coming from good prana, if they work right. So it's a practical teaching as well as having a spiritual context or meaning. And I'm only going to take you up to the next point, and we're going to abandon this chart because this is about food. The rest of it is a very wonderful study. If you can look into Footfalls, I didn't find the page it's on for you. It's probably near the beginning of the book. You can study this chart in full based upon this introduction, and then make all those connections from food to prana to mind. We want to go one more step up the right-hand column and say this about it, though. There's a kind of prana called mukhya prana that sustains and supports the organs. It sharpens the 5 senses. Remember, we looked here is that you must purify the senses in this route that we looked at. Sharpens the senses and maintains life in the body. But it must be invigorated by ingestion of pure food, otherwise ill health results. So you can see how the relationship between the food and prana goes both ways. If you eat food and the prana is not awakened and does not flow, then you're going to have to go back to your diet, as many people are finding, and make some modifications there and see what does work. And at least in this day and age, it might not have been so difficult earlier, but now there are a lot of extenuating circumstances around foods, markets, sprays, fields, non-organic, organic, vegetarian, meat. So we're having a lot of extenuating circumstances around that, which are going to take a little bit more what? Stamina. We're going to have to persevere. And then just a quick mention, going up that side, there's a thing called ojas that comes when you connect food with mantra to practice, mukhya prana to practice. You'll feel ojas. If that's not happening, then you're going to have to go back and look why. That the prana might not be flowing fully through you because you want to have the body healthy and the prana flowing, and it's supposed to expand your mind's ability to know Brahman. Apyayantu mamangani vak pranaschakshu shrotamata balanindriyani cha saravani. So body must be healthy, life force must flow unimpeded, mind must then expand in its capacity to know Brahman. Brahman never expands. Mind expands in its capacity to know Brahman. And that's going to be the illumined mind that knows Brahman. The ordinary mind never can, as you may have heard. Ojas even can go so far in the refinement as to become tejas. And that would be this light shining off of these great beings because they've sanctified everything they've taken into themselves. And they haven't stopped just at physical food. They read the scriptures, and their minds had the discrimination to read the scriptures and extract the essence from the scriptures and understand then the Dharma, the Jnana teachings that destroyed ignorance, and then finally reach that state of realization of truth and turned into tejas, the ability to give it to others. Isn't it a beautiful, even though we've gone through it swiftly, look in footfalls to study it more, write me questions. I take emails readily and answer them quickly. And then you'll understand more about these first early steps of returning the soul's ability to connect energy to mind, to have a relationship again with everything external, and then so that it leads to the internal, instead of just remaining fixed or fixated with what's external. You're supposed to know the external, and then know the internal, and then fuse them, so that there's just one state left, and then meditate on that state, pass your time contentedly, and be free, is how Shankara describes it in the Viveka Chudamani. Om Drishyam Pratitram Pravila Payan Sanmatram Ganam Anandam Vibhavayam. You see, so you take these outer and inner, Bahur, Antur, Bahuram Va, and just fuse it into one thing. Oh, I see, the whole thing was one all the time. I just lost the connections to it. It's the same with mind and prana and body. This is all one Brahman, one indivisible Brahman, one state of consciousness. I'll look at it at different levels in order to understand and destroy ignorance. But in the end, it's all going to come back to that natural unity, the nectar of naturalness, Avadhut calls that. Moving along so that we make some progress on the first class, let's go back to our Manaha Prana Sambandha chart and look at where it's taking us. It's going to be very inspiring, I hope, and I hope you'll be enthused about it, this next series of classes, to follow this entire route, which has Shiva in the middle and Vivekananda at its back, and find out how to make this living prana flow into the nadis, the channels of our mind. We know that the blood vessels are supposed to flow with their energy into the brain. Then just take that as the physical template or example of what's supposed to happen when the prana flows into the mind. The psychic prana into the mind, the physical prana into the body. I'll show you something about that next week when we get to what's called the tanmatras, or the subtle senses. how they look exactly, reflect exactly what the outer pranas are doing with the energy, but how they work in the mind, the psychic prana. That's coming up here. So, with the limited time remaining, we've looked across the top tier of this chart. Again, food, gain strength from it without getting obsessed with the body. Increase your stamina without getting obsessed with failing to go forward, to use that stamina to benefit yourself in the yogic path, which of course comes with asana, mastering your posture. Then making sure your senses get purified and your breathing can get equalized. That, because of bad habit, posture and breathing might take you a little time. So some people come to the path already with these well in hand, like the Vedantas, for instance. You don't find the Swamis or the teachers of Patanjali's yoga emphasizing too much or fixating or obsessing with too many postures or too much breathing exercise, because too much breathing exercise can imbalance the mind, says Swami Brahmananda, and also Holy Mother said that. So you want to do it moderately under the guidance of a teacher, just enough so that this prana can start flowing. You already know wood's and fire. You just put a little tinder there, light it with a match. It'll flame up by itself. So you just kick this process off with the right amount. It's like the homeopathy of early yoga, if you want to call it that. And just get it started, because then you'll remember. It's all about your mind remembering your connection. It's not about creating a new connection. It may be about destroying obstacles to old connections that are there. Whatever the case may be, the point here is then to work a little bit on your posture so that you can sit like this, like Buddha did under the tree for a matter of weeks until he finally got what he wanted out of that long meditation. And if you have to breathe in for 8 counts, hold your breath for 8 counts, breathe out for 8 counts, increase it to 16 or 12 later, so that you reteach yourself the secret of prana and breath and how they connect, and you can balance yourself out. Your mind feels better, your food digests better, your senses work better. Then you're beginning to get this connection between life force and thought and mind. And the prana is about to be mastered. This is in the Upanishads, they'll start you out with that, like the Yoga Kundalini Upanishad. You start reading it, and where is this going to start? Or it starts right here. If you can't discriminate between the real and the unreal, which is where you should enter into the path, you should come with that already in hand if you're an embodied soul, then you go back and master your prana, because something has fallen out of the prana, isn't able to take the prana. And so that's what I want for the next 10 or 15 or maybe a few minutes longer if we want to stay. I want to show you this new chart that has to do across the top with this level that we just looked at. So putting this together early, because we want to go quickly to what happens and what has happened, I think, to most people who don't still feel that natural attraction to the divinity within them. I remember when I was a teenager, I was feeling that longing all the time. I couldn't explain it. I didn't have a teacher to go to ask about it. My parents knew nothing about it. You couldn't go to your brothers and sisters because they weren't interested in it for the most part. And so you had to work it through those early years of your life in the West, in the United States in my case, going to school, and not getting answers from the fallen irreligion of the day, let's call it that way, and seeing people around you already beginning to fritter away and squander their prana, although you didn't have a word for it yet. They were partying, they were socializing, they were living a life of insouciance, they were mimicking their parents in that. And morality and ethics were enforced in some families and so forth, but you didn't see people adhering to that with any kind of enthusiasm, like, why am I being moral? Because I want to meet the king of morality and the king of immortality too. I want to have this utsaha, this great enthusiasm that rises in the breast to know my maker, if you wanted to put it in those words back then. So basically, it all comes down to that point of a decision of the soul to either go towards strength or towards weakness. And you can see there in our chart, there's a nice signpost for that, pointing right to strengths that you must inculcate in yourself or bring back, and going to left to where weaknesses set in. And that's what I want to use the rest of our time for, is looking how parts of the mind, like in this image here, the whole part, left-hand side of the, from our perspective, the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the brain here is just falling apart into oblivion. Those connections are being forgotten. Rust is setting into the connection process, and weaknesses is occurring. The weakest link in the chain is already beginning to part and is going to snap. And I found a beautiful quote from Swami Vivekananda just recently that I hadn't seen before. Here at the top, he says, "The pleasure of the self is what the world calls religion." So you could see how far then religion had fallen from the sincere seeking of God to just depending on the pleasures of the world. He goes on, "But the more our bliss is within, the more spiritual we are. Let us not depend upon the world for pleasure." Just a very quick mention he made on this point in some of the talks he gave that were listed down. So the difference between the heaven-seeking senses and even heaven on earth seeking senses, and this yearning that I'm trying to describe that Sri Ramakrishna talked about when people ask him about it. How do we find our way in this life? What's the way? Because they had found out that the life of everyday eating and sleeping, producing a family and so forth, they came to him saying, I'm not feeling it, I'm not feeling it, I'm not feeling connected to this. And there are lots of problems around me. Warlike nations are invading my country, and religion is falling apart in my own country. What's the way? And he said, you must yearn. You must learn to yearn for God. So if that yearning isn't there, driving it on, like I felt when I was a teenager, and then I finally met Lex Hickson, our founder here, and I finally met my teacher, Swami Sheshananda, who gave me great impetus along the path, then there could be some real heavy karmic debt to pay, some real hell to fall into. That's what happens that I tried to describe here in our remaining time down this side of left-hand side in our perspective of the chart. So it all starts there, you see, with severed connection between mind and prana. So we are starting back here with this idea of manaha prana sambandha, to show how if we don't connect the prana to the mind again, this is what can befall us. As an individual, as a family, as a nation, as a world, it's happening. So there's a severed connection there. I don't know what prana is. Let's put it that way. Like Vivekananda is saying, yeah, you don't know what prana is here. You don't have any provision for it. How can you have an inner life that moves inwardly, takes your conscious inwardly, if you don't have knowledge of the prana? The next point is life force moves unevenly through nerves and nadis. So erratic vibration happens. The shakiness that you feel, the unevenness of thought, which is coming later, but basically if it has all started with bad food or no higher teaching of the import of food and of stamina for the journey, for the spiritual journey. I'm taking a dharmic journey here on earth rather than I'm just here to enjoy. You know, if all of those things are gone, then it's quickly to hell in a handbasket for you. And then the loss of discrimination around proper food comes. You see, so you can see how all of this has, you've probably seen it yourself if you've lived 50, 60, 70 years or so in the body in this age, how everything went down the hill and fast food things started coming. We didn't see any of those back then. They were not chains like that. They were a couple businesses and so forth, and they were already beginning to give the wrong idea of, you know, fast food and all that to us, as opposed to what? As opposed to sitting down, you know, with the mantra, saying, blessing it, and taking it in a peaceful state of mind so that it turns to nectar instead of poison in your bloodstream. And then you see the lethargy of the body and dullness of the senses happens. And there's one of the factors that made people back in the 60s think, gee, I don't think I want to go here, I'm not feeling right. How do I move out of this? I think I'll eat some sprouts, you know. Back then that was the first thing that occurred to people. See, alfalfa, you know, the cows are peaceful, maybe I should eat that, you see. So they began to go towards these health foods that people were looking down their noses at, meat eaters and so forth, and they began to look for food that wasn't sprayed or wasn't being sold just for money and profit, and try and put some purity into the situation. So some discrimination around proper food is lost otherwise. Then loss of interest in physical fitness and / exercise. So that's also going to help your breathing come back to normal. If you run, if you jog, if you swim, those kinds of things, you find that your lungs are worked. Even if you walk, and you'll find out that you have, your breath begins to even out naturally. Or put it this way, if you don't do those things, you stop breathing, which later is a good thing, ironically enough. The suspension of the breath is actually a very high state later, but not at this juncture. Then the breakdown of natural immune systems happen. I also often think about that with COVID and Omkara, I call it, you know, the latest virus and all that. Basically, that if you kept up your yogic immune system, then you'd be fine. That's just if you'd learned it before, because it's another phenomena that's rising out of the mind, and there are a lot of people out there who can keep their balance in that is keep eating good food with a balanced state of mind and keeping the positive attitude around it. And even if they do get that and they don't fear it, because fear is one of the things, as you'll see here, that settles in, then they have the best yogic immune system possible against all these problems. Not just against the virus, but against warring nations and against family feuds and backbiting and backstabbing in business, a whole host of things that are out there that are viruses unto themselves. So the balance of the in-breath, suspended breath, and the out-breath gets compromised. I'm trying to give this to you blow by blow, thinking back from the teachings I received to people I saw in high school who were falling into this already, and how they were squandering away their life force. How did I know that? Because I looked back on it and met some of these people from school 10 or 20 years later, and their life was over. They had gone that route, and they had no real awareness of the purpose of life. They were confused. They were out of shape. They were overweight. They weren't breathing properly. They weren't exercising. I saw it happen to so many people out of my youth. So I inferred later, you see, that, oh, I see now the dharmic path wasn't introduced to them. They didn't have that yearning to try and reach out. See, to connect the mind to the prana, even if they didn't believe in God yet. You don't have to believe in God for some of these teachings in India. That might come later, called faith. What you have to do now is get yourself balanced again. Yoga, isn't it? And that's going to save you from all sorts of suffering. if the breath gets imbalanced, there's that natural three-part movement of the breath gets imbalanced, then the thinking process becomes easily confused. And people's thoughts are wandering, or worse. And it's hard to bring them back. Daydreaming, imaginations, fantasizing. It's called sankalpa in Sanskrit. And people have seen, seers have seen whole cross-sections of races fall into that, and families fall into that bad habit of wandering mind, brooding mind. Then violent acts are perpetrated due to this erratic prana. Well, here's where karma really comes full force back at you. If you had just been a dull boy and, you still had some access to your conscience, then everything would have gone along without accruing so much negativity in your mind. But that's not what happens quite often. The hand that reaches out to do violence would not have done so if the prana and the mind had have been united in a relationship, and it had have been able to control the action. You were in control of that act. You didn't lose control all of a sudden and commit this negative act. How do I know this? By working for 20 years in prisons, trying to teach yoga and Vedanta to people there. So I have my authorities, the great souls that I follow, and I have the teachings from the scriptures, but I also have my own experiences in a society for many decades now, and seeing what's happening and looking back to where I came from in order to make these kinds of conclusions and encourage people to reconnect to these great teachings. Because if violent acts are perpetrated and the prana is spiking, you see this, the prana is going like this, spiking and valleying and so forth, or it's just going into a deep valley. The father of yoga has names for those. We'll see them in a minute here. Then mind gets imbalanced. It loses its conscience and it loses its memory. So they don't have a conscience anymore around doing evil. They can so easily, I've seen that in prisons too with some people. They just insist that they were right in doing what they did. And they have some chip on their shoulder about somebody punishing them because they did something wrong. Better if you just admitted it, get over it, and got out of prison and went back and become a productive member of society, as they say. But that's what karma tends to do to the mind. And it gets beset with doubt, fear, and guilt, and remorse. How about that for the four traps? We call it the four traps in India. There's a teaching on that, which I have on another chart. And yes, we are going a few minutes over so we can finish this part of the chart, set ourselves up for next week's, and I'll have some more better positive news for you of what strength looks like. But we have to go through this with food, stability, prana, and mantra, and karma in order to make these connections. Finally, penultimately, it says both body and brain become subject to multiple diseases. And then death and rebirth in ignorance take place. That's how a deep dive into Maya takes place, or revisiting the ocean of samsara, or being reborn without a clue as to who you are and where you came from, and finding no meaning in it. How can a mind that's that far lost regain balance again? That's a good question there. And you'll have to go to a teacher and begin the path somehow. You could just go back to food and gaining strength, building up strength. So I'll end here with reading this quote on the bottom. Kind of summates what we just looked at. And we can probably read this quote to start off next week's class. But it says, obsessing with matter causes longing for sense objects. Enjoying objects then creates attachment. Brooding constantly upon one's attachments causes the mind to forget its own ability to think and act freely. In this process of self-actuated bondage, parts of the mind and its energy, prana, crystallize, and pieces of its memory and intelligence fall into oblivion, as this picture is showing the side of the weakness side of the head on our chart. The internal weakness that ensues makes it difficult to gather the mind's awareness back again and regain that essential concentration necessary for success in all areas of life. This has been called by the father of yoga and others, kshipta, scattered mind. It is responsible for the condition of the stunted human mind that is thereby restricted to only two areas, fragmented and dull, called muda. So we just looked at two of the 5 states of mind in Patanjali's 8-limbed yoga. The others being vikshipta, sometimes balanced, sometimes imbalanced. And then one-pointed, ekagra, and finally niruddha, where mind dissolves into its highest source, like a hailstone into the ocean. So with that, then we'll end here with this hour or an hour and 15 or 20 minutes that we've taken in part 2 of how the mantra destroys karma, which we will get more at next week's class when we look at the strengths that mantra develops in us as we move on towards the end. And in deference and reverence to Swami Vivekananda, we sing Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurur Devo Maheshwara, Gurur Sakshi Param Brahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Gurur Brahma, Gurur Vishnu, Gurur Devo Maheshwara, Gurur Sakshi Param Brahma, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha, Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Om Brahmanandam Paramasukadam Kevalam Jnanamurtim Dandvaititam Gagana Sadrusham Tatvama Shari Laksham Ekam Nicham Vimlamachalam Sarvadi Sakshi Buddham Bhavati Tam Triguna Rahitam Sadgurun Tanamami. Om Shantihi Shantihi Shantihi. Om Peace, Peace, Peace. May peace be unto us, may peace be unto all. Om Hari Om, Hari Om, Japa Hari Om Tat Sat.